I'm just always used to looking at somebody over my shoulder coming after me. Okay, it's time to begin. This is where you need to be this morning. Glad you're here. 1 Peter, Elaine, 1 Peter. Brother Tim, how you doing? I'm doing okay. All right. We were looking, I don't know if you still have your outline from last week, but I wanted to finish it up. And if you don't have a copy, that's okay. But anyway, we were looking at glorifying God during difficult times. And Peter gives the Christians some specific things that I think are very helpful for us to remember when times are not going very well. We need to also recall that the situation that the Christians were in the first century probably were more challenging in one sense than what we ourselves are experiencing because it was the pressure of the culture and persecution that was paramount against them, which, you know, we haven't necessarily entered a time in our local area where Christians are persecuted and, looked at with contempt. But that doesn't mean that although we may not be to the degree as they were in the first century, that what is stated or communicated is not helpful to the degree in which we do face hardships and challenges. So I think there's a very practical application for us to assimilate, to understand these are the things, if they work in those difficult times, they're going to work in, a whole range of degree of challenges and problems. So I think in looking at these, he's very, very practical in what he says, and sometimes what he recommends seems not to be, really you're telling me to do this when this is going on? It's that kind of thing. It's I keep going back to King Saul sometimes when the first king of Israel, when he was told to wait for Samuel before he went into battle, so Samuel could offer a sacrifice and, everything could be right with God, and God gives his blessing on Israel to go to war. And yet Saul noticed that the enemy was, getting ready to pounce, and he felt like he was losing the advantage, and he needed to take advantage and not be caught off guard. From a human standpoint and wisdom, that makes a lot of sense. You want to not be caught off guard. You want to be ready for whatever incursion, or even to strike before they strike, which would be a wisdom thing to do from a practical standpoint. But Saul had to learn that it is God that gives the victory. It is God that's going to protect Israel. And when you act on your own impulse in a certain way, you're showing lack of trust in what God has told us to do. And that's a battle that I think all of us face during life. Should I act? I see these things, and I know I need to do this, and God says this, but hey, this is happening. So it's almost as if this thing bypasses the religious instruction that God has provided. Well, the truth of the matter is that Samuel needed to wait Saul needed to wait for Samuel to come and offer the sacrifices. That would have been an action of faith on Saul's part, and that's what God responds to. That's what God is looking for in us, is to have that trust and faith to wait upon the Lord, and He will lift you up. So the things that are being suggested here are not just things to do in church. Okay, it is a life thing for us to absorb and to practice. Now, we looked at last week, just to remind you real quick, the idea of the name Christian falls 3 times in the New Testament. And each of the contexts tells us something about the nature of Christianity. The first one is Christianity, by its nature, is inclusive. That is, it is for all who would desire to know God and come to God through Christ. There's no barring of any social group, ethnic group, or anybody like that. The other thing is the gospel or Christianity is based upon persuasion, not in lifting up the sword or threatening someone. You better become a Christian or I'll cut off your head. Or something of that nature. Christianity takes the position of persuading individuals and communicating the gospel so they will make the decision to come to God. Just like what Paul was doing when he was defending himself before the Jews. He almost persuaded, remember Agrippa said, "You almost persuade me to be a Christian." And that's what Paul was doing. He was giving evidence. He was attempting to persuade all of those who were listening to him. He uttered no threats. You remember Jesus, Peter reminds us that Jesus didn't utter any threats to those who were crucifying him. So there's a standard of behavior and thought that Christ gave us as an example that Peter uses. And then in 1 Peter 4, verse 16, he talks about the fiery trial that the Christians are going through. And when he says a fiery trial, notice he's giving emphasis to the degree of pressure that these Christians are facing. Why not just call it, the trial? Why a fiery trial? Well, that's the way of accentuating and acknowledging that they are having a very difficult time. So he encourages them to persevere during these challenges that you're facing. Now, that's the situation, and that just comes with the territory of being a Christian. If you're being a Christian, the name itself is letting you know that there are certain things that we assume that will be a part of Christianity, and that is, there's going to be trials, there's going to be pressures, there's going to be attacks by those who are not appreciative of what Jesus has done, those who are, against goodness and righteousness and, faith. So we should anticipate those kinds of attitudes. So what do? Well, first thing is you fight against the temptation to give up by not giving in to the pressure. This is one of the motivations that Peter has encouraging the Christians, because there's always that temptation to do what? To say, I've had enough, I can't take it anymore, throw in the towel, cry mercy. And it's not that Christians don't get to a point where they are frustrated or they feel a lot of anxiety as to what's happening. Read the Psalms. All of the Psalms, well, I say a great majority of them, are about the idea of God, where are you? How long is it going to be? Come save me, deliver me from my enemies. So it is not that you won't feel that way at times, and it's not that, there won't be, pressure even from those around you to do what Job's wife said to Job, why don't you just curse God and die? You know? So Peter says we got to fight against that external pressure and also that internal self-talk that might be going on in our head. So in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 14, he says, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. So what does that have to do with persecution? Why is he talking to me about being holy when I'm being threatened or I've lost my job? See what I'm saying? It's almost as if God's on one level and I'm down here, and it don't make any sense. Why talk about holiness when you're hurting?
It's not a reaction that human beings give, right?
Right.
We want to get upset, yell, scream.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the emphasis is that to be holy means you're setting your mind or your task in serving God and pleasing Him than focusing and becoming absorbed to such an extent in the situation or circumstance that it causes you to drift away. The time really to amplify your plug-in to God is during those times that are difficult, right? So Peter's reminding us that despite what you're going through, there's never a time in which pursuing holiness is not a practical answer to your problem. And so it sounds somewhat impractical. I need something else besides being reminded. I know that's the Bible. Be ye holy for I am holy, but what does that have to do with the circumstance that I'm in? Well, it has everything to do with the circumstance that you're in, because the temptations and the problems will be that you may find yourself drifting back into that which Jesus saved you from. And you don't want that to happen. How do you secure yourself? Work out your own salvation, so to speak. It is to even, drill more deeply down into, God, being rooted in God during those times. Look at verses 17 through 18. He says, and if you call on Him as the Father who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. Conduct yourself with fear. One of the major themes of wisdom in the Old Testament and the New Testament is that of fearing God. And as we know what the book of Ecclesiastes says, keep His commandments, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, there needs to be a healthy fear for betraying the Lord or rejecting Him, okay? Because from that comes punishment, all right? There also needs to be an overwhelming attitude of reverence for God that rises above my circumstances. It's like how a friend is betrayed. I don't know if you've ever been betrayed by a friend, or maybe someone you thought was real close to you later spoke badly about you, or even revealed something about you that you gave that person in confidence, right? For whatever reason, I don't know. But you had a relationship with a friend or someone, okay? And so your relationship to that friend, despite any pressures, let's say the government comes, the Roman government or other people in your community are trying to get you to turn against this friend or to say something that would incriminate that friend, to betray that friend, the Christian will do what? And they'll threaten you, you better, and you can save yourself. But what is the Christian going to do? He's not going to do it. Why? Why wouldn't we take advantage to save ourselves, even though our friend takes the fall? Why would we do that? Huh?
I said we pray we won't betray.
That's what I'm saying. That's
Because we humans are, strange people.
yeah, they are, and fickle people too.
Yes.
So what is it that keeps one faithful to a friend? It's the relationship they have with that friend, right? They know that friend. Okay, make that friend God for just a minute. Okay, so you're being pressured to turn against that Lord of yours. Okay, and this is the way out. If you do this, or you tell on another Christian, or you lead them to somebody, who is a Christian, there's all kinds of pressures, peer pressures, and authorities, and and whatever. So what do we do in that situation? Well, this is what's being discussed, I think, in regard to fighting against that impulse. Look at verse 17, 18 again. He says, and if you call on him, the Father who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourself with fear throughout the time of your what? Exile. How will fear preserve me during the exile? I think it's a good question. That's the positive aspect of fear, isn't it? Who's the greater? Put it.
Is this meaning we fear him like, oh, I'm scared to death, or do we fear because it's a respect for the Lord?
I think it has both. That's the thing about fear. Sometimes it's contextual, maybe reverence or awe, but it's a two-sided coin.
Well, this is really my wording is a little different than yours.
Okay.
What you read from it. It's called strangers, pilgrims.
Yeah. Pilgrims, exiles, strangers in this land.
Well, we're here for a short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And if we stay steadfast and fear the Lord, we know we've got a home waiting for us that's not in this world.
Right. And so this is, you remember what Jesus said? He said, do not fear them who can what? Kill the body. But fear him who can destroy both body and soul, where? In hell. All right? So it is to recognize the greater holiness of God, and it's telling us to lift our eyes up above the circumstances that we're in that would tend to influence us or motivate us to maybe act in a way that wouldn't be, a faithful act. So in that respect, it is practical advice for Peter to remind them of the holiness of God and to conduct yourself with fear, that knowledge of who God is. Okay? So it may not be the words that they're wanting, help me now. Well, y'all come to my assistance. Maybe we can rally up the Christians and come out here and storm the doors of the principality's office, and bind him up and say, don't threaten us again, man. We're going to send hell and brimstone on you if you mess with us again as Christians. Or it's not the idea of, well, I'm going to take this Christianity and lay it aside for a while because times are difficult. When times improve, then I'll put on the cloak of Christianity again because it's easier to be a Christian. See, those things are not, couldn't even be fathomed But like you said, human beings are somewhat fickle and do strange things. So fight against that temptation that would, cause us to be led astray in some way. Look at chapter 4, verses 3 and 5. He says, "For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. But they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead." Hey, this is the answer to living your life in fear. See how he added that little tag note there? Don't follow them in their debauchery. They think it's strange. You're what's wrong with you? You're acting a little weird. Understand that all the things that are listed there in their lifestyle is a part of the pagan and Roman society, And probably, I would assume that many of these Christians had come out of that, and so when they're not participating in things that they used to do, are not seeming to support the community around them in regard to certain traditions and behaviors, they're like a target. There's probably a reaction to that, because what do you think the community thinks about these Christians who have stopped, participating in things that they used to? So what would be some natural responses from the outsider?
Think you're better.
You think you're better than us? I'm sure that's a part of it. What else?
Maybe, just maybe, it makes them look at just how bad they're living.
Yeah.
What they're doing.
Because,
And they,
yeah.
and that's even today. You become a Christian, sometimes a Christian has to give up friends and things they used to do because those friends don't want to
Yeah.
change and they're not going to change, so you have to move on.
I like how Paul puts it. I think it's in Ephesians 5 when he says, don't participate in the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them, which is what light does. It reveals and exposes. People may now feel uncomfortable around you. But even beyond that, natural reaction, they can start looking at you from their own worldview as being an infidel or an even worse sinner, because you're not a part of their worldview. So they can look at you in disgust, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. This is one of the things that Christians in the first century had to deal with. They were called atheists, right? Because they didn't believe in the Roman gods or the pagan gods. And as a result, you're an atheist. Well, they believed in the one God, but that wasn't good enough. What about the other ones? They were believed to be very, very immoral in that they would have these love feasts. That's what they were called. That's when they observed the Lord's Supper. They called it the love feast. We call it communion, the Lord's Supper, and they had, it was the feast, observing the bread and the fruit of the vine. And they also called themselves brothers and sisters. And all of this to the Roman and the pagan mind was kind of like, gross. These people are really, really weird. So it's that kind of thing, you see, that they're facing. And what you don't do with that kind of attitude towards you and that kind of pressure is to give in. It's to step up. It's to cling to the behavior that draws from the holiness of God. Because as he said, in living our life in fear, he says that they will give an account to the one who's ready to judge the living and the dead. We've got to keep that in mind, because there is a healthy dose of fear. Not only respect, but with that respect, you have a healthy dose of fear to the one who is sovereign, right? For this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead, and though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way God does. That's the goal.
Talking about the dead being dead and
Spiritually. Yeah, I think it's the same language. Peter's using it in a different kind of way than what Paul does. You know, it's God quickens the dead. We were dead in our trespasses and sins. He said they were dead. Now you live in the Spirit. What does it mean to live in the Spirit? And because I throw the word spirit in there, it's not all kind of, whoa, spirit. You know, that's how sometimes people look when every time the Spirit's mentioned, we've entered some kind of mystical type of thing. Well, what does it mean to live by the Spirit?
Just walk in the light of His.
Yeah, walk in the light, the fruit of the Spirit. It is to live according to the oracles, as Peter would say in chapter 4, verse 11, even when preach as the what? The oracles of God. Not the oracles of the pagans at Delphi or others where they had the priestess or whatever would come out. And it's interesting reading some of the history is that the pagan religions were very adept at creating alternate personalities by using various things that they burned and that caused hallucinations and things of that nature. People could go in the temple and they see things, you know, and hallucinate, and that's because of you know, things that were the incense that was burnt and all that. It was intended to trick the mind and cause a euphoria sometimes, or cause some kind of trans-dimensional trance in the individual. And there was a big thing when the oracle would come out, the priestesses, the one that would give communication, there was lots of flamboyance, and they would deliver an oracle, a word from the pagan god. And Peter uses that language, and 1 Peter 4:11 says, if any person speaks, let him speak what? The oracles of who? God. God is the one that communicates his will. So in the backdrop of the highly religious people in paganism stands in contrast the true God and the true worshipers and followers of God who stand by their behavior in opposition to all that's going on. So it was, you know, a very, very challenging time because there was lots of pressures. The other thing is not only fight against the temptation to give up by giving in to these pressures, but we need to learn to silence the critics by accepting nothing less than the highest standards of behavior. That's the practical word given to those who are being pressured and persecuted. It's not the time to lax in our behavior and commitment. It's time to stand firm. And isn't that true? You know, I've said this before in regard to the cultivation of virtue. How do you cultivate virtue? I'm talking about those, you know, those characteristics of patience and forbearance and, you know, doing good things. How do you cultivate virtue? Integrity, what? Yeah. You have the opportunity to practice it when it's called upon. to be practiced. Okay, that's when you really, I mean, we could talk about integrity all day long, but how do you know, or how do you work on integrity? You work on integrity, you know, by those circumstances that come our way, that require us, that demand from us, that integrity that we're committed to. So if a virtue that God is calling us to have is to be patient, I could talk about patience. I can give you a seminar on patience, you know, It doesn't mean anything until you're in a situation
You have to put it into practice.
when you got to practice it. And that's when it falls apart, right? So what Peter is emphasizing is very important, because use this time, he is telling them, use this as an opportunity for growth. And I think to validate and to affirm that you're doing right. Because a lot of times, what's said against us is a validation that we're actually doing what's right. You know, so that's one of the things that's difficult, that seems so practical and almost not useful during a time of trial. The one thing that I find interesting here is that everything that he talks about has to do with employing action in some form or fashion. That it's the choice that we make, the action that we do, is what I think gives us a stronger foothold in our faith and a confidence in what we're doing. So in chapter 2, verses 13 through 14, we're to submit to civil authorities. Okay, well, what if the authorities are unrighteous people? What if the authorities are not good people? What if? So we keep the laws that we agree with, and we ignore those that we don't agree with, or we slander and we talk smack about who is a leader. And Peter is saying, you know, watch yourself and be a person. If we're going to have excellence of character, then submit to the authorities. Do what the law requires. You know, and I would dare say also to watch our talk in regard to those who are in charge, and that's very, very difficult to do, right? But in that idea of submission is to recognize it's the authority or the government that God has established. Okay? Now, it doesn't mean that God has condoned the evil person who's in a position of authority over our lives and creating hardship. But it is, you may not, it's like the statement, you may not like the president, but you do what in regard to the position? You respect the position. See what I'm saying? It's that kind of thing. Yes?
Some folks think all government's evil. But unless they're telling you to do something
Right.
that's against God, evil, you should follow the authorities.
Yeah.
Especially, I mean, like I said, some folks just think some folks have that, like to use an example, Trump derangement syndrome. But you may not like him, or you may think all government's evil, but unless he's telling you or the government's telling you to do
Right.
something, then you should still follow
Yeah.
the government. Right?
There's only one exception. when we don't follow the government.
That's when they're not following God.
Yeah, when God's way, when the ways are pit against each other, that's where a Christian has to make the stand. So there is a limitation. You know, we follow God's way. You know, the Bible and the book of Acts indicates that in regard to the apostles. We shall obey God rather than man. When the authorities were saying, don't preach anymore this Jesus. Don't convene anymore for worship. What do we do then? We convene. It's what Christians did a lot of that in secret. They convened together, didn't they? We have to make certain decisions based upon God's mandates because we live our life out of fear in regard to God and not the fear of human beings. So this is very, very suitable for what these Christians are facing in the first century. So the other thing is to live responsibly, not to use their freedom as corruption for sin. The other thing is in chapter 2, verse 18, the idea of deferring one to another. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrow while suffering unjustly. This is several times this kind of language is used, that this is the will of God and pleases God. When you suffer for wrong, not for wrongdoing, but when you suffer unjustly, why is that pleasing to God? Is he saying he wants you to suffer? No, I don't think he wants you to suffer. But when you suffer unjustly and you endure as a Christian, that is very pleasing to God.
Because you glorify him.
You glorify him in doing that. Chapter 3, verses 1 and 5, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if they do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. When they see you respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, putting on gold jewelry, or clothing you wear, but let your adorning be hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty and gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very what? Precious. Submission to God is a very precious thing, not only for men, but also for women. Not only for husbands, but also for wives. Why? What does it show?
Humility.
Humility. It shows faith. That God knows the order of things. He knows how we ought to be. Now, I use this a lot of time as a joke in my marital relationship. The women are to be like Sarah, who called Abraham what?
Master.
Lord.
I like Lord. Now, what that means is exactly what Paul meant in Ephesians 5. That he says, husbands, you need to love your wives, and wives, do what for your husbands? What's the word that he uses? Interesting enough, he doesn't say love.
Respect.
He says respect. He says respect. That's the illustration there. That word Lord is like, it's a term of respect.
We don't have any problem with that if all men love
Well, I
their
know.
wives. If all men love their wives like Christ of the church,
Exactly.
there wouldn't be a problem, I don't believe.
Well, I would agree with that.
Should.
But the problem is, whatever, if I'm a Christian wife or a Christian woman, the circumstance doesn't dictate my Christianity, does it? No. If I'm a Christian husband or a Christian man, the circumstance that I'm in doesn't determine my behavior. The behavior is set by whom? God. See, that's the real challenge, is it not? In our behavior, because what society does is it's kind of like situational ethics. What's situational ethics? Y'all have had that before in school or whatever. That was a big thing in the church, several decades ago. Situational ethics.
So are you gonna act a certain way in certain situations, or?
Yeah, it's part of it. I think it was, I can't remember the guy's name, it's Fletcher or something like that, who came up with the overriding thing is love in every situation. So the abiding principle is how I demonstrate love. The problem with it was his definition and how love was construed. And situational ethics is, whatever situation you're in, we do the best that we can do in that situation. Hopefully it's guided by love, but love needs to be defined by whom? God, right? Our compassion may be inordinate compassion if we're not careful in tolerating sin. You remember in the Corinthian church, the person that was having a sexual relationship with his stepmother was in the church at Corinth, and the church, they were patient, maybe compassionate, letting things get along. What did Paul say? He said, man, you need to pluck that individual from among you. This is not acceptable. And so we have to be guided not only emotionally by God's mandates, but also in our reasoning in serving God. So the two main things that existed in the first century for exposure to the community was the family. And if you're not careful, when difficult times come, there can be strife and problems within the family. The other thing is, when there are pressures, there can be talk and murmuring about the government authorities. And so to keep our behavior excellent means that we accept a higher standard. It's like, at Faulkner University, we have Bible majors. I expect the Bible majors to have a higher standard of behavior than everybody else on campus. Would I be right in that? In accepting that or having that demand? They may say, well, it's unfair. I'm like everybody else. Well, you don't need to be, because you're studying to be what? It's not that you're to be perfect or anything, but you shouldn't be doing some of the things that others are doing that's obviously not right, or participating in some things. There's a higher standard. You're studying to be a worker in God's vineyard. So there has to be a higher standard. Well, isn't that true also of leaders, elders, or deacons? I know the qualifications that are given are really applicable to people, the majority of the qualifications, to what being a Christian is, but certainly a leader needs to have a good degree of what those qualifications are, right? You accept it. This is like any person in a business. You accept a certain position. I had to accept a certain standard. We have to accept a certain standard. So defer one to another. Be considerate Chapter 3, verse 7 talks about husbands love their wives. You know, be considerate, demonstrate humility in all matters, show zeal in doing what's right. And I'll end with this. One of the neat things about this behavior is that there seems to be an implication in how wives conducted themselves in the marital relationship and how Christians in conducting themselves in the broader culture, that there will come a time when those people who are unbelievers glorify God in the day of visitation. I think that implies that they converted to the Lord. That there's a strong application that the behavior and the commitment can have a positive effect around many of the people that we associate with. And for some to glorify God on the day of visitation, it seems to imply to me that they impacted people for eternity. All right. Thank you much.